Before a live nation, Jasmine Crockett stormed into Congress and faced Kash Patel, the man selling walls of steel, fear, and profit. He mocked, he sneered, he branded children invaders. But when Jasmine rose, silence struck the chamber. One line shattered his power, exposing cruelty and cowardice. What did she say that froze Congress itself? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room felt like a pressure cooker dressed in marble and velvet. Cameras swept every corner. The banner-lived congressional hearing on border security flashed across every screen in America. Committee members sat along the long table like generals at war. At the center was Kash Patel, shoulders stiff, expression rehearsed. His tie was blood red, his flag pin sharp as a blade. He leaned into the mic, eyes cold and sure. "We are launching the Fortress program," he declared. 600 more kilometers of wall, and drones scanning an 80-kilometer stretch near the southern border. He held up a folder and tapped it hard. Because when your home is robbed, you build a wall. America's no different, and anyone against it sides with criminals. The silence that followed was heavy planned. Applause broke from Republicans like thunder on cue. Patel's smile spread. He knew the game. He was baiting, showing off with the ease of someone sure he wouldn't be challenged. Then the back door creaked. Heads turned. Jasmine Crockett walked in, late, steady, like a storm on her own clock. In her hand was a small cloth-wrapped object. She didn't hurry. She didn't grin. She walked straight to her seat, unwrapped the bundle, and set it down in front of Patel. A miniature wall metal, cold, unfinished. A prop that didn't whisper but roared. Patel turned, clearly amused. He laughed, not with humor but with insult. "Well, well," he said, leaning back, voice thick with mockery. "I thought you got stuck at the border. Or maybe you were climbing over a wall of..." Intelligence laughter burst from the Republican bench. Hands clapped. Some rocked in their chairs, smug in the act. One senator slapped the table like he was in a bar. Still, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She only nodded once, calm like someone who already knew the end. She looked at the model wall, then back at him. Her voice was low, steady, but sharp as a blade sliding free. "Tell me, Mr. Patel," she asked, "this wall you build, is it to stop so-called invaders or to block the fear you've never dared to face?" The room shifted. Laughter died. An aide dropped a pen. Patel's smile stayed but hardened like a mask refusing to crack. Crockett's eyes locked on his. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved. But every word pressed down on the room like stone on a chest. The silence after Crockett's question was like the pause before a storm. But Patel wasn't the type to back down. He answered not with reason but with a show. His hand moved with practiced timing, reaching into the binder before him like a magician ready to reveal a trick he'd rehearsed many times. In one quick motion, he pulled out a big laminated photo and lifted it high for all to see. It was a blurry image, a man crossing a desert alone, back-bent legs dragging in the sand. His shirt was wet with sweat, and a torn nylon bag hung from his shoulder like a weight of silence and desperation. Patel's voice cut across the chamber like a gavel. "This," he declared, "is the kind of man she defends." His finger jabbed the photo as if the stranger on the page had insulted him. "This is who they are. Drug runners, criminals, parasites draining us." His words were not arguments, they were charges dressed up as facts made to hit the gut, not the mind. He shifted, scanning the room, jaw locked with self-righteous pride. "They don't come here to build. They come here to bleed us dry." The chamber didn't cheer, it smoldered. Unease slid like smoke through the gallery. A few Republican staffers nodded, some smirked. But most only watched. Not because they agreed, but because they waited to see if Crockett would break. They expected anger, maybe shouting. They didn't expect what came next. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hurry. Jasmine Crockett moved like someone who had heard that insult all her life and had learned to answer it, not with rage, but with fire under control. She reached into her folder slowly with purpose, the kind of motion that says, "I'm not reacting, I'm ready." Her fingers slid over papers like a pianist finding notes. She pulled out one page and set it down. Then another. She looked at Patel, not with defiance but with clarity. A look that said, "I see through this noise, and I came ready." "Let's be clear," she said, her voice steady, conviction sharpened to precision. Pew Research 2023, 58% of undocumented immigrants in this country entered legally. She let the word hang long enough to slice through old assumptions. They didn't cross deserts. They came through airports, through ports, and they overstayed visas. She didn't glance down. She didn't need to. This wasn't data, it was memory. Of people she had met, families she had defended, lives turned into numbers by men like Patel. That wall you praise, she went on eyes locked. It won't stop expired visas. But I suppose nuance doesn't raise campaign cash, does it? The room froze. Not out of shock, but because they knew she was right. An aide in the back adjusted a headset and scribbled notes, not about policy, but about damage control. She didn't pause for him. She turned another page stamped with a seal, a chart, and a yellow highlight screaming truth. And the drugs she pressed, voice steady. 71% of seizures at the southern border, not immigrants on foot. U.S. citizens, driving cars, crossing checkpoints. She took a single step forward, small but seismic. So unless your wall can read passports and expose hypocrisy, it won't fix your fantasy. Murmurs rolled like a storm in the distance. Someone coughed. Another leaned forward, unsure whether to interrupt or stay quiet in the weight of her words. Across from her, Patel stayed still, but something in his stance shifted, jaw, tight fingers, trembling near his notes. His smile, so wide minutes ago, had flattened into a thin line. When he spoke, his voice was low-strained, dripping with disdain. "You sound like lines from a bad Netflix drama," he sneered. "What you lack, Congresswoman, is not numbers. It's dignity and the ability to speak like someone who lives in the real world." It wasn't logic. It was a swing, bitter, crude, personal. Laughter flickered behind him again, weaker this time, more habit than faith. The sting of Patel's insult still hung in the air, but Crockett didn't waste time nursing wounds. She came armed with history, and it was about to turn the weapon back on him. There was no rustle, no dramatics when she reached into her case, just a slow, deliberate motion that silenced the room more effectively than a gavel. From the depth of her briefcase came a single manila folder. It looked ordinary, almost too thin to matter. But when she placed it on the desk, there was a gravity to it, the kind of weight that didn't come from paper, but from truth. Her fingers slid it open with care, then lifted the first document high enough for all to see. Her voice when it came was quieter than before, but somehow even more dangerous. "This," she said, holding it steady, "is the immigration file of Mr. Pramod Patel, your father." The name fell like a stone into a still lake. All movement in the chamber slowed, then stopped. Kash Patel's smile fractured ever so slightly. He hadn't expected her to go there, not into his past. She wasn't speaking to score political points anymore. She was reaching into bloodlines, into the origin of identity. According to federal records, she continued, Mr. Patel entered the United States in 1970, a refugee from Uganda, ethnically Indian, fleeing political unrest. Her tone was clinical but not cold. Every word was carefully chosen, her cadence like a surgeon's incision, slow, deliberate, irreversible. She wasn't weaponizing history. She was reminding it that it had witnesses. Then she looked up, not at the camera, not at the crowd, but directly at him, the man behind the wall. "You," she said, "come from a family that was protected. No walls, no ICE raids, no slurs like invader tattooed onto their paperwork." The air felt thinner. Some in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. One Republican aide adjusted their headset. Another looked down at their phone, pretending to take notes. No one interrupted. No one dared. The weight of her words was undeniable. Patel's existence in that room was only possible because half a century ago, America had opened its doors, and now he wanted to weld them shut. Across the table, Patel's jaw tightened. His grip on the desk hardened. He wasn't smiling anymore. His lips curled inward, the tension in his face betraying a man cornered, not by politics but by memory. When he spoke, his voice was coiled, tight, acidic. "My father came here legally," he said, spitting each syllable like a nail. "Not like the ones you're trying to legalize with pity and tears." The words didn't land like arguments, they landed like defenses built on sand. It was not a response. It was a recoil, and Crockett knew it. She didn't move from her spot, didn't raise her voice, didn't blink. She reached forward gently, placing the file flat on the table in front of her. A quiet act, but it felt ceremonial. Then she straightened her shoulders and her voice dropped just a note lower, quiet enough to draw people closer, strong enough to hold them there. So let me ask you, she said, gaze locked on him, if Pramod Patel arrived today, undocumented, with dark skin, no paperwork, crossing through Texas. She let the sentence hang. The stillness was total. No coughs, no whispers. Just the echo of unspoken judgment rippling through marble. Then the blade, would you let him in? Another breath. One heartbeat. Or would you lock him in a steel cage and call him a threat to the nation? The final sentence landed like a verdict, not shouted but delivered with surgical precision. No one moved. Not Patel, not the audience, not even the cameraman. Because in that moment, everyone in the room understood something visceral. When truth is spoken plainly, it doesn't need to scream to shake the ground. The question lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot, but Crockett wasn't done aiming. Her next shot wasn't rhetorical, it was human, and it carried the weight of a child's silence. She moved slowly with intention, like someone preparing a courtroom for evidence that couldn't be dismissed. Her hand hovered above the touchscreen embedded in her desk, then tapped once. The overhead screen behind the witness table blinked to life with a faint hum, replacing charts and graphics with something unfiltered, the kind of image that doesn't need explanation. A photograph. No filters, no statistics, just a child. Jacqueline Cowell, age 7, eyes closed, lips dry. Her cheeks were sunken and skin pale under hospital lights. Her hands too small to resist anything rested on her chest. But the detail that hit hardest wasn't her stillness. It was the plastic band on her wrist, ice-issued white with black numbers. A barcode on a body that never made it home. The room stilled. The fluorescent lights above didn't flicker, but somehow everything felt dimmer. The soundscape collapsed into silence, except for the low hum of the broadcast equipment. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom in or retreat. No one spoke. No one needed to. The image had stolen their breath. Jasmine Crockett's voice, when it came, was measured as if she was carrying something fragile in her throat. "This is Jacqueline Call," she said, her tone holding the kind of grief that doesn't crack, it sharpens. 7 years old. From Guatemala. She didn't raise the volume. She didn't look for applause. She died in ICE custody in December 2018. A few heads lowered. One aide swallowed hard. Crockett continued, her eyes unwavering, her cadence that of a litigator unwrapping the final layer of truth. Cause of death, dehydration and bacterial infection. She begged for water. Her father begged for help. She turned her gaze directly to Kash Patel, her voice not louder but heavier. And ICE said she was adequately cared for. Her hand gestured slightly toward the photo. So I ask you, what exactly in that wall protected this child? What barrier stopped the lie that she was safe while she died with government plastic still wrapped around her wrist? It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was a scalpel meant to cut through bureaucracy, through performance, through the empty language of national security. And it did. The silence that followed was not discomfort, it was exposure. Patel's posture stiffened. His grip on the table tightened, knuckles whitening just enough for the cameras to catch it. His jaw clenched, not in mourning, not in reflection, but in preparation. He was not here to concede. He was here to win. And so he fired back, voice sharp, dismissive, and cold. That little girl shouldn't have been here. He snapped, his tone no longer defensive, but almost accusatory. If her parents had respected the law, she wouldn't be dead. The line landed like a slap. No one clapped. No one laughed. Even some on his side shifted uncomfortably. Because it wasn't just callous, it was calculated. A weaponized dismissal of a child's life. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice came back slower this time, colder, like steel pulled from flame. That sentence, she said, eyes like iron, should be etched into every wall at every ICE facility. She pointed toward the screen still glowing with Jacqueline's image, her hand trembling, not from emotion, but from focus, the kind that comes from choosing not to scream. So that every person who walks past it knows this place doesn't kill people. It just pushes them to the edge of what a body can survive. Her final words didn't ring. They sank into bone, into conscience, into memory. And somewhere through the tension and lights, the system finally blinked just once. The image of Jacqueline Cowell still lingered faintly on the overhead screen, now dimmed, but not forgotten. Her absence was now a presence, one that haunted the room like unfinished prayer. But Crockett wasn't finished. Not yet. She knew the conversation couldn't end with a child in a coffin. It had to turn to those who survived the system only to be broken by it in other ways. Her body straightened, her voice cooled, and her next strike came not from the screen but from memory. I want to tell you another story. She began her tone quieter than before, but colder like steel in winter. She didn't look down at her notes. She didn't need to. A woman from Honduras. She crossed the southern border with her 4-year-old son. She didn't speak English. There was no translator, no explanation, just protocols. The words felt sterile, and that was the point. Crockett let the weight of bureaucracy hang in the air like a lead curtain. The ICE report read, and I quote, "Unable to confirm biological relationship separation, protocol initiated." She let the final phrase fall like a sentence. Not a legal one, a human one. The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not reverent, but raw. Crockett continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but carried by a tension so tight it could slice through glass. That little boy, he couldn't speak, not even Spanish, just a rural dialect. Her eyes stared forward unfocused like she was seeing that child right then. He cried for 19 days, alone, in a fluorescent box. No mother, no language, just fear, just cold, just a number. Her hand reached into her folder, then paused not to show something, but to control the tremor in her fingers. Then she turned to Patel, her tone sharpened like a scalpel. "You say you fear transnational crime?" She said, her voice steady. "But what you really fear," she paused just enough for the silence to lean in, "is a child who doesn't speak English, whispering 'Mama' in a frozen room while his lips turned blue." That sentence didn't echo. It absorbed. It didn't land like an argument. It landed like a mirror. For a split second, Patel didn't move. His eyes' narrow jaw twitching as if deciding between silence or retaliation. But pride was faster than shame. "I don't need a morality lesson from someone playing the victim on TikTok," he snapped, his tone half amused, half threatening. "I build walls to protect America. You build theater for the cameras." The jab cut through the air like a thrown blade. A few Republican aides behind him chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because that's what power trains people to do in the face of moral challenge. Laugh. Crockett's expression barely shifted, but the tension in her jaw betrayed the storm below. She waited, letting the disrespect float linger rot in the open air. Then her lips curled, not in amusement, but with the clarity of someone holding a weapon that doesn't misfire truth. "If your America needs a wall to feel safe," she said slowly, "then maybe it's time you ask who's really in danger and who's just been pretending to be brave." Her voice didn't rise, but it shook something. Not in the chamber in the story they were all writing in real time. The broadcast camera didn't cut away. It zoomed in. And for once, even the wall behind Patel, literal or metaphorical, looked like it might crack. After exposing the heartbreaking stories of detained children, Jasmine Crockett changed tactics. Now she wasn't just speaking from emotion, she was targeting the system that profited from those tragedies. Jasmine Crockett moved calmly but with quiet intensity, like someone who knew she was holding a weapon. Not a gun, but the truth. She opened a red folder and placed one document on the desk, clearly visible. "This isn't a speech," she said firmly. "This is a financial document, and it tells the real story." On the screen behind her, a large email appeared from a Republican campaign group dated June 2019. In bold letters, it read, "More wall spending, more fundraising in Texas, Arizona. Fear of immigration, Chargers Kash." Crockett pointed to the screen. "They didn't build the wall to protect people. They built it to raise money." She clicked a button and the screen changed to show 4 construction companies. Each one had red circles around it. These companies who got rich from building the wall just happened to be top donors to Republican super PACs in 2019 and 2020. The audience started to shift in their seats. Then came her final blow. She zoomed in on one company, Lone Star Border Solutions. Beneath it was a caption, official sponsor, Patel speaking engagement, Dallas TX. Crockett's voice dropped to a deadly calm. That's not national security. That's a backroom deal dressed up in border wire. Kash Patel leaned forward, visibly annoyed. You're just trying to distract from the real issue, he said. You're siding with people who break our borders, not Americans who live in fear. Crockett didn't react. She stared into the camera and spoke clearly not to Patel, but to the millions watching across the country. Her words were sharp and final. I stand with the people who can't write campaign checks to your friends. The room went quiet. Someone dropped a pen. Reporters leaned in closer. Patel said nothing. No one laughed. No one clapped. The silence was louder than any shout, because in that one sentence, Crockett had exposed the real wall, not one made of steel and concrete, but one made of money and political lies. And for a moment it cracked. The chamber still echoed with Crockett's voice as she exposed how campaign donors had turned fear into funding. But this time she didn't reach for money. She reached for something far more haunting, a voice America had tried to forget. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence made more noise than most men's anger. She reached down and opened a thin, worn folder with a yellowed sticker, Detained Minors Without Counsel. Internal use only. The title alone made some in the room sit up straighter. Her fingers paused at the first page, a spreadsheet with row after row of names marked simply as unknown. No guardians, no lawyers, just ages 3, 5, 7. One child had simply been listed as a prox, 2 years old. She looked directly at Patel. There are more than 4,000 children in your system right now without any legal representation. More than 60 days locked up, some for months. She turned the page. ICE labeled them non-cooperative. You know why her voice cracked just slightly, not with weakness, but fury. Because they didn't speak English. Because they cried too softly to be understood. She leaned forward and placed a small recorder gently on the desk in front of Patel. She didn't announce it like some grand reveal. She simply pressed play. At first there was static, soft and distant. Then from the speaker came a whisper. Faint, broken, a child's voice, maybe 4 or 5 years old. No, Mama. Please, cold. Mama. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't defiant. It was smaller than that, almost like breath clinging to the last sliver of comfort it knew. The kind of sound you couldn't unhear once it entered your bones. The chamber changed. You could feel it. Reporters stopped typing. One Republican aide turned away and bit her lip. Patel, still staring ahead, now lowered his eyes, not speaking, not out of respect but discomfort. Crockett stood still. Her words sliced through the silence. That is the real wall, not the one made of brick, but the one made of ice inside every decision you sign. Her voice didn't rise, but the accusation was seismic. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, it haunts. She didn't have to wave flags or show pictures this time. A whisper from a cage had done more than any argument could. The camera panned the room. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats. Some looked away, but not Patel. He was frozen not by fear, but by something worse, the slow realization that this wasn't just about borders anymore. It was about what he had chosen to ignore. The chamber still felt cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the hollow weight left by a child's voice echoing from a detention cell. And just when it seemed the silence might linger, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, not to plead, but to deliver judgment. She rose with a steadiness that commanded attention, the weight of every immigrant's untold story, seemingly stitched into the fabric of her dark suit. In her hand, she carried the small metal model of the border wall, the same one she had quietly placed on the table earlier, now raised for all to see. As she moved to the center of the hearing room, her heels echoed sharply on the polished floor, each step a drumbeat. She didn't need permission. The floor was already hers. Crockett paused, held the model high, and turned slowly, making sure it faced the cameras, the senators, the nation. The steel glinted under the overhead lights like a relic from a broken promise. Her voice was steady but unmistakably sharpened by fire. You didn't build this to stop crime, she said, looking directly at Kash Patel. You built it to preserve a version of America, one where only certain skin colors get to be called legal. The air thickened instantly. Some clutched their pens tighter. A few aides stared down at their notes pretending to read. But most couldn't look away. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The truth didn't need volume. It needed conviction. And Crockett wielded it like a blade honed by history. She took one small step forward, slowly lowering the model and resting it on the table between them. Her eyes never left Patel's. The room, the hearing, the network broadcast, all of it had collapsed into this single moment, a reckoning. And then her final blow landed not with fury, but with a truth that burned colder than anything ice could engineer. The wall you built doesn't stop immigrants, she said softly but clearly. It stops you from having to look at yourself and remember that your ancestors were once strangers too. Time didn't move for a moment. Patel sat motionless, his jaw locked. His brow twitched, but he didn't speak. The camera zoomed in, catching everything: his clenched fists, the sudden dryness in his throat, the way his eyes flicked just for a second toward the model wall sitting inches from him, a symbol of power now reduced to a mirror. No rebuttal came, no applause, just silence, a silence thick with consequence. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett stood alone, not victorious, not theatrical, but unshaken. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to end a lie. For a moment, Capitol Hill felt like a church after thunder, stunned, breathless, frozen in its own reckoning. But outside that chamber, the world had already begun to move, and the aftershock would prove more powerful than anything Kash Patel had ever feared. At 2:36 p.m., barely 10 minutes after the hearing concluded, the first clip was online. Shot from a CS-PAN broadcast, it had no music, no graphics, just raw footage of Jasmine Crockett raising a miniature wall and delivering the sentence that would pierce through the nation's collective defense mechanisms like a blade. The wall you built doesn't stop immigrants. It stops you from having to look at yourself. By 3:00 p.m., the clip had gone viral. By 5:00 p.m., it had been shared by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ava DuVernay, and a former ICE attorney who tweeted, "I've been in that room. No one's ever done what she just did." It was titled a dozen different ways: Crockett's Wall Capital Mike, Drop the Mirror Moment, but one label stuck and spread like wildfire: the Wall of Fear. Within 24 hours, the phrase had been printed on T-shirts, painted on protest banners in Phoenix, quoted in college classrooms, and displayed in LED lights above Times Square. Online viewership hit 20 million, not counting reposts on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, or Instagram Reels, where the algorithm carried it like gasoline on open flame. CNN led with it that night. Anderson Cooper looked into the camera, unusually quiet, before he spoke. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge border policy, she exposed it. The Karen beneath his words read, "Crockett dismantles border wall logic in one sentence." The panel discussion that followed was interrupted 3 times, not by breaking news, but by replays of that one moment. Slow motion, close up, the raise of the model, the silence after, the flicker in Patel's eyes. Fox News, meanwhile, was in a state of visible scramble. Tucker Carlson's stand-in opened his segment with a clip of the same hearing, but abruptly cut it after Patel's sarcasm, avoiding Crockett's full quote entirely. "She's playing to the cameras," the host scoffed. "Propaganda, not policy." But even as the studio mocked, the network's social media team was dealing with thousands of comments from viewers, many not left-wing, asking the same question: why didn't you play her full statement? Right-wing radio tried to pivot. "She used a toy wall," one commentator jeered. "This is theater," but that backfired. The image of Crockett's hand holding a tiny silver wall against a sea of polished wood desks became symbolic: David facing Goliath, with the slingshot replaced by data and defiance. Meanwhile, people started digging not just into Patel's policy, but into the funding trails Crockett had hinted at in earlier testimony. Twitter threads mapped GOP campaign contributions from border wall contractors. A new petition called for a congressional ethics probe. And in Arizona, a whistleblower from a private construction firm posted anonymously, "She's not wrong. They don't build for security. They build for donations." Everywhere the clip wasn't just playing, it was transforming. Civil rights groups began cutting it into outreach ads. College students turned it into spoken word poetry. Immigrant advocacy organizations played it during rallies, always with the same crescendo, Jasmine's final line, followed by a beat of silence, the audience hanging in that echo, like it was holding breath for history. But it wasn't just activists or journalists who were reacting. In living rooms across the country, something more intimate was happening. A Mexican grandmother in El Paso watched the clip and wept quietly, whispering, "Por fin alguien dice la verdad." A young girl in Queens, undocumented DACA, protected messaged her mother. She stood up. For people like us. And across middle America, even among voters who'd been trained to fear the border, something uneasy crept in, the haunting realization that maybe, just maybe, the wall wasn't keeping something out, but keeping something broken in. Editorials erupted. The Atlantic published a piece titled, "A Wall, a Mirror, and a Reckoning." The Guardian called it the most unflinching moment in congressional history since Anita Hill. Even the Wall Street Journal, cautious but not dismissive, noted, whether one agrees with her or not, Crockett has forced a confrontation with the emotional infrastructure behind our physical borders. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She didn't tweet a victory lap. She didn't do press. She let the words speak for themselves, and perhaps that made them land even harder. Because in a world of noise, her stillness became power, her restraint became fire, and the clip, that 2-minute grenade, continued to detonate in loops across America's screens and consciences. Truth didn't need a studio. It didn't need spin. It just needed someone brave enough to hold up a mirror and say, "Look." Crockett's final blow hadn't just silenced a man, it cracked open a nation's collective memory. As her words echoed beyond the marble walls of Congress, what followed wasn't policy or protest. It was testimony, raw, unfiltered, and long overdue. Across the country, something rare happened. People didn't argue. They remembered. And as if some invisible signal had been fired through the airwaves, thousands, then tens of thousands began to speak up. Some whispered their truths through social media posts. Others shouted it in town halls, churches, radio call-ins. The stories flooded in like a tidal wave. Not even the most fortified wall could hold back. A woman in El Paso uploaded a faded photograph of her father, a wiry man in his 60s, sunburnt, wearing a reflective vest and stained work gloves, standing next to a segment of the steel wall he had helped construct near the Rio Grande. Her caption struck like lightning. "My father laid bricks for Texas, but they still called him an invader." It was only 12 words, but it was shared 600,000 times in a single day. In her replies, strangers left their own echoes. "Mine too, we were called pests. He fought in Vietnam but came home to ice." From Detroit, a video went viral showing a Mexican-American teenager placing a small brick wall, crudely built from Legos, on his family's kitchen table. He looked straight into the camera and said, "My abuela raised me while her hands bled from picking onions." You don't build walls for people like her. You build them to forget her. The screen faded to black. No music, just silence. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment came from a group of Afghan-American veterans who published a handwritten open letter addressed to those who say we don't belong. Signed by 21 South Asian soldiers, it read, "We didn't just serve in uniform. We bled for this country. We returned with scars, flags, and the smell of desert sand still in our boots. But when we land at JFK, we still get pulled aside. We still get asked where we're really from. We don't need walls. We need memory." The New York Times ran it front page. The Atlantic followed with a profile titled "Forgotten Patriots When the Builders Are Treated Like Intruders." News anchors started asking questions not about Border Patrol, but about the soul of the country itself. On a radio show in Los Angeles, a 73-year-old Vietnamese refugee named Mr. Liu spoke quietly about his first day in America in 1975. "We landed with nothing. My wife wore the same shirt for 2 weeks, but someone gave us a cot and soup. If there had been a wall, then my son wouldn't be alive. And he's a doctor now." His voice cracked. The host didn't respond. They let the silence hang, a silence louder than outrage. In Tucson, a Catholic church held a vigil. People walked barefoot, carrying candles and photographs of their families. One woman held up a sign. "My mother was called illegal. Now she's a nurse who saved lives during COVID." The man next to her, an older black gentleman in a Vietnam vet jacket, held a poster that simply read, "I was the stranger." My son is the soldier. In these stories, Crockett's words found new breath. The line he built that wall, not to stop crime, but to avoid facing himself, was spray-painted across underpasses and turned into protest banners. But it wasn't just activism. It was exorcism, a nation vomiting up what it had long buried. Because beneath the debates and statistics, one thing had been made terrifyingly clear. The wall was not made of steel. It was made of forgetting. It was forgetting that generations of immigrants, legal, undocumented, desperate, brilliant, had labored in silence while their names were stripped, their accents mocked, their hands blistered on fruit crates and concrete. It was forgetting that the same country now debating their legitimacy had begged them to work, clean, fight, and build, then pushed them into the shadows. A Muslim baker in Dearborn posted a short video from his kitchen floor, dusting his arms as he kneaded dough. "I've been here 27 years. I've never asked for help, but I've hired 42 Americans and fed thousands. If I'm still an outsider, then maybe it's not about the law. Maybe it's about the mirror." Even children began to speak. On YouTube, a 9-year-old girl read aloud a letter to her congressman, hands shaking. "My mom cries when she hears the word wall. I think it means something bad happened to her, but she still tells me to love America. I don't get it, but I believe her." And then came the moment that no one expected. A Republican councilwoman in Tennessee, once a vocal supporter of the border wall, posted a video of herself, eyes swollen, voice hoarse. She read from her grandmother's immigration papers from Poland dated 1939. "She came here fleeing bombs. She didn't speak English. She wouldn't have passed today's merit-based system. But she gave birth to my father and he taught me to believe in fairness." She paused. Maybe Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy a man's logic. Maybe she just held up a mirror, and I saw someone else in it. That video alone reached 3 million views. Even conservative media caught in a swirl of backlash couldn't keep pace. Fox News attempted to pivot with headlines like, "Is Crockett exploiting immigration tragedy?" But their comments section told another story, thousands of viewers recounting their own family arrivals, their own tears at Ellis Island, LAX, Brownsville, JFK. One comment read, "My grandfather came here with one suitcase. Now I own a construction company. We were the strangers. We built this place too." Crockett had said nothing since the hearing. No new interviews, no victory lap. But her silence only made the echo louder. Because sometimes it isn't the loudest voice that breaks the wall. It's the quiet, unrelenting truth that climbs over it. The stories had gone viral. The headlines blazed. But none could prepare the chamber for what Jasmine Crockett would carry next into Washington, the weight of a child's question and a wristband that spoke louder than words. She stepped into the Capitol not as a legislator that morning, but as a messenger. In her hand she held no stack of legal briefs, no grand binder of testimony, no prepared remarks with bullet points and color-coded tabs. She held a single transparent evidence case about the size of a paperback novel. Inside it, a worn ice wristband, its barcode faded, still smeared with the faint pink of a child's skin. The number printed on it wasn't just an ID, it was a scar carved by bureaucracy. She didn't clutch it for dramatics. She carried it the way one would carry an urn. The chamber was already packed. C-SPAN cameras locked in from every angle, flashing red. Journalists whispered. Her opponents smirked, expecting another emotional plea, ready to roll their eyes and tweet jabs about liberal theater. But Crockett walked slowly, each step measured like she was crossing a courtroom, not a floor of Congress. Her heels tapped not just across marble, but across history, a history written in separation, detention, and silence. She approached the table, and instead of opening a laptop or adjusting her mic, she did one thing. She placed the transparent case in front of her, right beside the microphone, and let it sit there, visible, accusing, undeniable. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't thank the committee. She didn't ease into the issue. "I recently visited the southern border." She said, her voice unshaken yet quiet enough that the room had to lean in. "I met a child 11 years old, born in this country, speaks English, goes to public school, plays soccer, loves peanut butter." She let that sit as if daring anyone to object. And he looked me in the eye and asked. She inhaled once, deep. Then her voice tightened. "I have citizenship. My mom doesn't, so why do I have to live alone? You could have heard a pin drop. The silence wasn't just stillness, it was pressure. Like the air had grown heavier. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't dramatize the moment. She let it do what truth does best: burn. Across the aisle, members from the opposing party shifted in their seats. Some glanced toward the cameras to monitor how this would play out. Some refused to look up at all. But Crockett didn't stop. She raised the case slowly, like holding something radioactive. She didn't open it. She didn't wave it. She just held it in the light. They call this a verification tool, she said. I call it the inheritance of fear. There it was. The indictment. Not of policy, of conscience. She didn't need charts, didn't need graphs, didn't need to project the boy's image on a 60-inch LED screen. She let the wristband speak for him. Let it tell the story of the night he was separated from his mother. Let it whisper what no camera captured: the quiet hours alone in the holding room, the unanswered questions, the ache that doesn't know how to articulate itself at age 11. No English, no Spanish, just the kind of ache that finds its way into the bones. That day she wasn't just addressing lawmakers. She was speaking to the country, to every home where someone said they should have come the right way, to every voter who thought asylum seeker meant criminal, to every system that turned a mother into a ghost and a child into a number. And still she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was pressing the country to look in the mirror and see what it had done in its name. The ICE officials in attendance didn't flinch. Their eyes stayed straight ahead, hardened from years of protocol. To them, wristbands were procedure, labels, categories, non-cooperative, unaccompanied, red flag. But to Crockett and to Diego, it wasn't a system. It was a sentence. The kind you don't get to appeal. Every time the barcode scanner beeped in a shelter or a field office, a piece of someone's humanity dimmed. That's what she brought to the table that morning. Not just a child's plea, but a record of the erosion of empathy. One wristband, one name, one boy. And she dared the chamber to call that political theater. No one spoke. Even Kash Patel, who'd spent the last hearings mocking her tone and credentials, kept his mouth shut. For once, silence became surrender. And for a fleeting moment in that room, the line between citizen and stranger blurred, and what remained was only this: a child who wanted his mother and a woman who refused to let his voice be lost in the noise. The echo of Diego's voice still haunted the chamber, yet it was not sorrow that filled the silence. It was momentum. Crockett, still standing, hadn't left the fire behind. What began as a courtroom defense had become something else, something heavier. Now, with the world watching, and the wall no longer a metaphor, but a mirror, she stepped into the heart of the storm, not to debate, but to declare. She moved toward the podium, slowly, the floor of Congress, stretching before her like a battlefield once soaked in policy and pride. Her heels clicked against the stone tiles, each step deliberate, as if she were counting down to something irreversible. Behind her, the ICE wristband still lay on the desk, like a cursed artifact, a single symbol of 1,000 silent stories. Her hands held nothing now. She didn't need evidence anymore. She was the evidence. Her voice began quiet, not weak, but concentrated like the air before lightning. Walls can be tall, but history is longer. It was less a sentence and more a truth old, as the land beneath them, yet impossible to ignore, now that it had been spoken aloud. The room didn't move. Even the cameras held still, reframing their focus, as if the machinery understood it too. This wasn't just another speech. This was a line drawn in concrete and conscience. The men at the back, suited and stiff, glanced at each other. Some scribbled notes, some clenched fists under the table. But Jasmine didn't look at them. She spoke past them, through them, into the very idea of the room itself. A wall cannot stop tears. It cannot cover the eyes of a child waiting for her parents on the other side of a border. Her voice stayed steady, but something about her presence surged like a tide against a rusted gate. You could hear it in the quiet, the undeniable pull of truth that made even the proudest spine lean forward. She wasn't attacking anymore. She was revealing. In those words, she collapsed the distance between policy and pain, between the pages of legislation and the tiny bed where a girl once cried herself into silence, between the steel of a barrier and the steel in her voice. She didn't raise her tone, she didn't need to, The gravity of her words did the work. If you forget that your ancestors once crossed oceans, if you forget that they arrived here with trembling hands and borrowed names, then today you do not deserve to call yourselves Americans. This was the breaking point, not for her, but for them. The line detonated across the room like an invisible shockwave. You could feel the shift. Some hands fell from armrests. Some lips pursed breath, held in. Eyes darted to Patel, whose face had frozen not in rage, but in something eerily still, a silence so brittle it could crack from within. And that precisely was the moment Jasmine Crockett reclaimed the narrative. Not just for herself, not just for the immigrants trapped between fences and forms, but for America, the version of it that had almost been erased by fear, masquerading as safety. Her words began to carry weight that reached beyond the floor, beyond the cameras, into living rooms where children watched their parents hold back tears, into classrooms where students had memorized Ellis Island but never heard of ICE detention, into boardrooms where campaign donors once traded fear for funding. But Crockett wasn't finished. She lifted her eyes not with fury but with something deeper: conviction forged in fire. They call it protection. I call it performance. They speak of law but forget humanity. They write bills but erase names. And for what? So they can point to a wall and say, "See, this is where we stop being afraid." Her voice didn't shake. It steadied like a ship crossing into open sea wind, at her back, truth at her side. The room stayed quiet, but not out of respect. No, this silence was different. This silence was the sound of power realizing it had lost the room, not politically, but morally. Jasmine didn't move from the podium, but she reached for something behind her, a folded American flag. Not new, not crisp. Slightly faded edges, worn corners, softened by time. A flag once carried by a deported veteran who'd served in Iraq, then been shackled at a port of entry and never returned home. She placed it down gently beside the ICE wristband. Two symbols, two Americas. And in the silence that followed, Crockett delivered her final blow, not with sound but with presence. She stood still, and the room, finally, began to see her not as the disruptor, but as the mirror. The chamber had gone still after her last words, not the kind of stillness born from awkwardness, but from awe. A stillness heavy with truth wrapped in the silence of a nation forced to look in the mirror. And as the camera zoomed out and the room exhaled, what followed wasn't applause. It was memory rising, shaking, returning. Sometimes a story doesn't end in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins there. In the hours after Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the Capitol chamber, the air outside felt changed, not just in temperature but in tension. Reporters who once scoffed at her presence now held their microphones tighter, unsure whether to question or simply record. Protesters on both sides of the iron fences found themselves momentarily speechless, their chants thinning as her final words replayed in the background of every live stream. That wall doesn't stop immigrants, it stops you from facing yourself. It wasn't just a line. It was a strike, precise, devastating, and irreversible. By midnight, clips from the hearing had already flooded the internet. One was titled "The Wall of Fear." Another, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she made America remember." Views climbed past 20 million in less than a day. CNN led their primetime segment with her closing remarks. MSNBC ran an hour-long special on the moral architecture of immigration. Even conservative outlets, usually quick to twist her words, struggled to find footing. Fox News tried to pivot. Crockett's comments were theatrical, not factual, but the sound bites betrayed them. No one could look away from the truth she had unwrapped, slow, deliberate, surgical. And it didn't stop with the headlines. All across America, something stirred. In coffee shops, people who had never agreed on anything found themselves nodding in stunned silence. Teachers projected her speech in classrooms, not as political rhetoric, but as a lesson in civic courage. A high school student in Phoenix wrote on TikTok, "I didn't think people like her existed in real life. But maybe we needed her more than we realized." At the southern border, murals began to appear, one of them showing a young boy reaching over a wall, not with fear, but with hope. The quote underneath, "We don't need more bricks. We need more memory." Letters began pouring into her office. Not from lobbyists or strategists, but from people. Real people. A nurse in Detroit wrote, "My grandfather came from Lebanon with nothing. He didn't speak the language." Today I saved a child's life. That's the journey your words reminded me of. A retired ICE officer wrote anonymously, "We built cages thinking we were protecting something, but we never asked what we were protecting it from. Maybe we were just afraid of compassion." Crockett read each one. She didn't archive them. She pinned them to a board in her office, a mosaic of forgotten stories stitched together by bravery. One caught her off guard. It was from a woman in Texas, a natural-born citizen who said, "My father built walls." Literally, for DHS. But they never let him forget he had an accent. He died with calloused hands and a broken heart. Thank you for saying what he never could. The pain wasn't just historical, it was present. It had names, faces, unfinished sentences. Meanwhile, Kash Patel had vanished from the media spotlight. Where once he had stormed onto every panel called press conferences with arrogant precision, now there was only retreat. He declined interviews. His team scrubbed comments from his social feeds. But silence doesn't erase impact. And his silence, thick, defiant, unrepentant, said more than his insults ever had. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet memes or hold rallies. She returned to the Capitol the next morning, ice wristband, still in her purse just behind a folded photograph of a Guatemalan girl named Jacqueline. When asked by a reporter why she wasn't taking a victory lap, she paused, then said, "Because there's no victory in proving a child deserved more than a cage." In a private moment later that day, she sat with her chief of staff and asked for one thing: the email archives from asylum cases closed in the last 3 years. She didn't want numbers. She wanted names. She wanted stories. Because she knew the wall didn't begin at the border. It began at the first lie, the one that said worth must be proven by papers, by silence, by lineage. She wasn't just fighting policy anymore. She was fighting erasure. By week's end, something even deeper began to emerge: a shift in culture. Churches started organizing vigils, not just for those lost in border camps, but for those forgotten in the narrative altogether. A group of South Asian veterans released an open letter. "We fought for this country not so it could build walls, but so it could remember who built it." A Black Baptist pastor in Georgia gave a sermon titled, "The Wall is in the Heart Before It's in the Desert." But perhaps the most powerful moment came not from a politician, not even from Crockett, but from a child. In an elementary school in New Mexico, a fifth-grade student named Miguel was asked to draw what America looked like to him. He drew a wall, but not as a barrier. On one side, a mother held a child. On the other, the Capitol building. Between them, a bridge made of paper, hand-drawn and crayon-colored. On it, he wrote, "This is the paper they won't let her have, but I give it to her anyway." It was never about the wall. It was about what we were too afraid to see through it. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with facts, haunted by memory, and unwilling to blink, had forced a country to stare. Her closing words echoed longer than applause ever could: "Walls can be high, but history is long. Walls can't stop tears, and they can't block the eyes of a child waiting for a parent who never comes. If you've forgotten your ancestors crossed oceans to get here, then you don't get to call yourself American today." That wasn't just a mic drop. That was a moral reckoning. So what is the human lesson? That security is not a synonym for cruelty. That legality is not the measure of humanity. That borders are not just lines on maps, they are lines in our conscience. And that a nation like a soul is only as strong as the walls it refuses to build between truth and power. In the end, Crockett didn't just challenge Kash Patel. She challenged every one of us. Not to tear down walls out of rage, but to refuse to build them out of fear. Because if one woman, black, defiant, unbought, could stand in a room of power and make the silence remember, then maybe the rest of us can stand too. And maybe, just maybe, America can be something worth crossing toward again. Her words hadn't just ended a hearing, they had cracked open a truth too long buried beneath politics and pride. But words alone do not move nations. What happens after the silence? That's where change either begins or dies. Change does not come with applause. It begins when someone stands up after the cameras are gone and asks, "What am I complicit in Jasmine Crockett's battle with Kash?" Patel wasn't a moment in isolation. It was a mirror held to every voter, every policymaker, every family who ever said those people, without knowing who those people really are. The ice wristband on her desk. It wasn't just a prop. It was a reminder of a system so obsessed with walls it forgot about bridges. And that system isn't just down at the border. It's in our hiring practices, our classrooms, our hospitals, our dinner tables. It's in every shrug when a child speaks Spanish and someone calls it un-American. It's in every policy designed to make people wait, not welcome. Every silence is a brick. Across the country, small acts of reckoning began to rise. In Los Angeles, a teacher rewrote her entire history curriculum after watching Crockett's speech, throwing out sanitized immigration timelines for real accounts of survival and exile. In Houston, a judge cited her words in an asylum case, calling the current detention system a stain masquerading as security. A group of architects in New York pledged to never again design facilities for ICE contracts. If a wall is built with fear, one said, then it's not architecture. It's moral decay in concrete form. And yet the confrontation forced more personal awakenings too, the kind that don't make headlines but reshape lives. A woman in Florida called her estranged mother undocumented and long silent. They hadn't spoken in 14 years. She said, "When I heard Jasmine say history is long, I realized mine didn't have to end in shame." A restaurant owner in Arizona, once proudly anti-immigration, quietly took down the "We speak English" only sign from his front window. When asked why, he said, "Because fear makes rules, but memory makes change." Even in the halls of Congress, whispers began to shift. Younger lawmakers, some of whom had never dared confront party elders, began quoting Crockett during committee debates. One freshman representative held up the phrase, "If your family crossed an ocean, don't close the gate behind you." The room went quiet, but this time no one laughed. Meanwhile, in the public square, conversations once brushed off as too emotional now demanded space. Churches began hosting forums titled Faith Beyond the Wall. Book clubs swapped thrillers for testimonies from detainees. And students from high schoolers in El Paso to Ivy League seniors began their graduation speeches by naming Jacqueline Call. Not as a symbol, but as a child who once whispered cold and was never heard again. But here's the bitter truth: systems don't dismantle themselves. ICE didn't close its doors the next day. Children were still separated. Judges still ruled. Fences still stood. The difference wasn't in the machinery, it was in the momentum. Because what Crockett gave people wasn't just a speech, it was a script for resistance. When she said that wall doesn't stop immigrants, it stops you from seeing yourself, she wasn't just talking to Patel. She was talking to every citizen who ever said, "This isn't my fight." To every voter who looked away. To every neighbor who heard a mother scream in a language they didn't understand and chose silence over curiosity. That line-piercing, unflinching became a challenge. Who are you when power lies? The answer in real life begins with discomfort, because to live out Crockett's lesson is not about feeling better, it's about seeing clearer. It's about asking why certain children cry alone in ice cages while others get bedtime stories in the suburbs. Why some families get second chances and others get secondhand blame. It's about staring at your own neighborhood and asking, whose fear does this street serve, and whose hope does it erase policy matters? But memory matters more. You don't need to run for office to apply this truth. You apply it when you walk into your school board and ask why immigrant parents aren't at the table. You apply it when you advocate for translated ballots, when you hire without accent bias, when you fund legal defense for asylum seekers or just show up in court to bear witness. You apply it every time you refuse to confuse legality with morality. Crockett didn't stand in that chamber to perform. She stood because silence had become complicity. And the legacy of her confrontation isn't a viral clip, it's a call to live differently. To live with memory, not just nationalism. With vision, not just policy. With courage, not just opinion. Because history, when ignored, has a way of repeating itself. The walls we build today are only echoes of the chains and checkpoints of yesterday. Crockett's stand wasn't only against Patel's fortress, it was against the long tradition of turning fear into profit. And when she placed her evidence on that desk, she was placing a mirror in front of every viewer, lawmakers, staffers, and citizens alike. The question was no longer whether a wall would rise in Texas or Arizona. The question was whether Americans would continue to build invisible walls inside their own hearts. To answer that question is not the work of a headline, nor the satisfaction of a trending clip. It is the work of remembering who we once were: refugees, dreamers, laborers, seekers of a place to belong. It is the work of deciding whether the phrase, "we the people," is a promise for all or a privilege for a few. Crockett's confrontation dared the nation to stop pretending neutrality was an option. Silence, she showed, is not neutral. It sides with the cage, not the child. And in that chamber, she did not simply expose Patel, she exposed us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.